For millennia, the Great Pyramids of Egypt have towered over the desert sands. For most of that time, almost everything about the civilization that raised them remained a mystery. The hieroglyphs were silent. The names of pharaohs slept in stone. That changed on the 15th of July, 1799. A French officer named Pierre-François Bouchard, working on fortifications near the town of Rashid, known to Europeans as Rosetta, was supervising work along the western branch of the Nile when his soldiers turned up a slab of polished black granite covered in 3 bands of writing, Egyptian hieroglyphs at the top, a cursive form of late Egyptian demotic in the Greek at the bottom. The same decree, repeated in 3 scripts, discovered during Napoleon's Egyptian expedition and later studied in earnest by Jean-François Champollion, the Rosetta Stone became the key that unlocked a civilization. After thousands of years of silence, the hieroglyphs began to speak again. Egypt, wrote Herodotus, the father of history, is the gift of the Nile. And so it was. The river was the lifeline of everything that followed. Every year, the Nile flooded its banks, depositing rich black silt across the valley floor and turning a thin ribbon of fertile land in the middle of the Sahara into one of the cradles of human civilization. When the waters retreated, the agricultural year began. Egypt would become one of the oldest farming societies on earth, raising wheat and barley, lentils and flax, on soil renewed by the river each summer. Long before there were pharaohs, there were villages along the river. By the late Paleolithic, the peoples of the Nile Valley were producing arrows and harpoons, querns and sewn skins, bone tools and pottery. Carbon-dated grain remains from Neolithic silos on the edge of the Fayum show that Egyptians were harvesting cereal by the 5th millennium BC. Reed huts and mud brick shacks rose along the river. Tribal chieftains began to claim authority that could be inherited. Small wandering bands consolidated into settled communities. Out of those communities grew 2 distinct lands. To the north, in the great fan-shaped delta, where the Nile divided into its branches and met the Mediterranean, lay Lower Egypt. To the south, stretching up the long valley as far as Aswan, lay Upper Egypt. The 2 kingdoms wore different crowns. The White Kredjet to the south, the Reded crown, the Dalkret, belonged to the north, and around the 1300 BC, those 2 crowns would be joined together. The era before that union is called the Predynastic period, and it runs roughly from 6000 BC down to about 3 to 150 BC. We have no written records from most of it, but archaeology has filled in much of the picture. The Hafan culture between Egypt and Nubia dates back from 2000 to 14500 BC. The hunter-gatherer societies that descended from it, the Kaddan, the Sibyllian, the Haraphan, gradually became more sedentary as agriculture took hold. The Fayuma culture, settled around the great natural lake basin south of the Giza Plateau, dates to roughly 5450 to 4400 BC. Its people built reed homes with underground food stores, domesticated cattle, sheep and goats, and worked in basketry and pottery. After them came the Merimd of the Western Delta, dating to roughly 5000 to 4100 BC, the El Amri around 4000 BC, with their circular plastered houses, and the Badarian culture of Upper Egypt, where the seeds of a more elaborate civilization began to take root. The Naqada cultures of Upper Egypt that followed, Naqada I, Naqada II, and Naqada III, saw an explosion of cultural and political development. Houses became more complex, with windows, hearths, and wattle and daub walls. Mummification, in primitive form, began around 3500 BC. Trade reached out to other regions. The town of Abydos, north of Naqada, became a sacred burial ground, eventually the great royal necropolis of Egypt's first kings. And around 3400 to 3200 BC, the hieroglyphic script began to take shape. The earliest known Egyptian writing comes from labels and pottery marks found at Abydos. Complete sentences would not appear until the reign of King Peribsen, 500 years later. By the end of Naqada Iyawi, the 3 principal city-states of Upper Egypt, Thinis, Naqada, and Nekhan, were jostling for supremacy. Thinis appears to have defeated Naqada, then absorbed Nekhan. According to some scholars, the final rulers of this proto-dynastic phase were a series of Scorpion kings, Scorpion I, Scorpion II, and a ruler called Ca. And then came Narmer. Narmer is the king who unified Upper and Lower Egypt. He is also widely identified with the semi-legendary means, remembered by later Egyptian tradition as the founder of the first dynasty. He married a northern princess, Neithhotep of Naqada, to consolidate his hold. He suppressed revolts in the delta. He pushed his armies into Canaan and Nubia, and under him around 150 BC, Egypt entered the historical age. The early dynastic period, from roughly 3150 down to 2613 BC, set the foundations of the civilization that would follow. The divine kingship of the pharaoh began. The two-land monarchy was institutionalized. Writing, sculpture, and architecture took recognizable shape. Narmer's son Horaha succeeded him and continued his father's expansion. It was under Horaha that the mastaba tomb, a flat-topped, rectangular mud brick burial structure, first appeared. Horaha was followed Bajur then Jet. Jet's wife, Mernith, may have ruled as regent for her infant son Den, or perhaps as queen in her own right. Whichever it was, she is the first woman recorded governing in Egyptian history. Den himself, around 2990 BC, is reckoned the greatest king of the first dynasty. He reigned for some 50 years, presided over economic growth and military success, and was the first pharaoh to be depicted wearing the double crown, the Pishent, that combined the white and red crowns of the two lands. After him, the dynasty wound down through the reigns of Anjib, Semerkit, and Ka, ending in the succession struggle that brought Hotepsachemwi to the throne and founded the second dynasty around 2890 BC. The second dynasty is poorly documented. Several king names appear to repeat earlier rulers, and chronology is hazy. Hotepsachemwi's name means the two powerful ones at peace, a reference to the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, which may have come unstuck in the previous succession war. After him, Rainab, also called Nebra, became the first ruler to link his name explicitly to that of a god, forging a new bond between monarch and the divine. Peribsen is unusual in that he openly aligned himself with Seth rather than Horus, once interpreted as the first stirring of monotheism, more likely a political move to distinguish himself from the Horus religion of Lower Egypt. The dynasty closes with Khosakemwi, who reunified the two lands, sponsored impressive building works at Hierakonpolis and Abydos, and fathered the man who would launch Egypt's golden age in stone, Djoser. The third dynasty opens with Djoser around 2670 BC, and it is at Djoser's court that we meet one of the most remarkable figures in all of antiquity, Imhotep. Imhotep was Djoser's vizier, chief minister, sage, astrologer, and architect. He was so revered in his own lifetime that an inscribed statue base of the king records his titles, and so revered in the centuries to come that he was eventually deified, worshipped as a god of medicine in Egypt, and identified by the Greeks with their own god of healing, Asclepius. He may also have served as Djoser's chief physician. Court records show that the king's senior magician often doubled as the kingdom's senior doctor. What Imhotep is most famous for is the step pyramid at Saqqara. Egyptian royal tombs had been mastabas, flat-topped, slope-sided rectangles of mud brick. Imhotep took that idea, replaced the mud with stone slabs carved to resemble reeds and tree trunks, and stacked 6 of them, each smaller than the last, into a pyramid. When finished, the step pyramid rose about 62 meters into the sky, the tallest structure in the world of its day, and the oldest large stone monument that survives. Beneath it ran a maze of corridors and chambers carved into the bedrock, intended to confound thieves and protect the king. The trick did not work. The tomb was robbed in antiquity. Only one of Djoser's mummified feet has ever been recovered. But what Imhotep had begun would echo down the centuries. The buried pyramid and the layer pyramid of his successors carried the experiment forward. Within a few generations, the Egyptians would attempt the impossible, a true, smooth-sided pyramid. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, the age of the pyramid builders, runs from the 4th through the 6th dynasty, roughly 2613 to 2181 BC. The historical sources are thin. The period is written largely in stone, in the great architecture and the inscriptions on funerary chapels. Art was standardized under elite patronage, all of it tuned to the taste of the capital at Memphis. The most famous works of the age, the pyramids of Giza, the Great Sphinx, still stand, and underneath them all stretched a vast and unprecedented bureaucracy, because only a strong central authority could coordinate the labor, the food, and the materials needed to build on such a scale. The architect of Egypt's true pyramids was a king named Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty. Sneferu probably inherited the unfinished pyramid begun at Medum by Huni, the last king of the 3rd dynasty. He completed it, and then, when its outer casing collapsed because it had been laid on shifting sand rather than rock, he started again at Dosher. His second pyramid, the bent pyramid, gets its name from the way its angle changes partway up. The workers had begun at a steep 55 degrees, realized it would not stand, and finished off at a more cautious 43. Rather than declare victory and stop, Sneferu began a third pyramid on a sound foundation at a consistent 43 degrees. The Red Pyramid, named for the rose-colored limestone of its core, was Egypt's first true pyramid, a smooth, regular 4-sided monument, originally encased in gleaming white limestone that was later stripped away by local builders. It rose about 105 meters into the sky. Around it, Sneferu built mortuary temples and a permanent priesthood to tend his memory. He left his son the wealthiest and most stable throne in the world. That son was Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. He is best known for the Great Pyramid of Giza. To the Greek writers who came centuries later, Khufu was a tyrant who oppressed his people. That image probably owes more to the legends of the Westcar Papyrus, a collection of magical tales discovered by Henry Westcar in around 1824, in which one of Khufu's sons brings a sorcerer to court, who claims he can reattach the head of a slaughtered animal, then to the historical man. The real Khufu was a campaigner against Nubia and Libya, a trading partner of Byblos, and a builder. Under his reign, the first known dam in human history was raised in the Wadi Garawi, in the eastern desert southeast of modern Helwan, Sad Dil Kafara, the dam of the pagans, an engineering experiment that gave the kingdom more reliable water for its farms. His greatest work was the Great Pyramid itself, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. Built over 20 years on the Giza Plateau, just outside modern Cairo, the Great Pyramid was probably a tomb, though how it was actually built remains debated. Most Egyptologists agree on some form of ramp system. The growing weight of archaeological evidence, workers' graffiti, the workers' village south of the pyramid, the trace of construction techniques, supports the conclusion that ancient Egyptian craftsmen built it using methods so familiar to them that they felt no need to record them. The pyramid's complex inner corridors, shafts, and chambers, and its eerily precise alignment to the cardinal points continue to attract fringe theories. The chief minister responsible for the work was Khufu's vizier and relative Himiunu, buried in his own mastaba nearby. The workforce was made up of skilled artisans and ordinary peasants, paid or compensated, fed, housed, and sometimes drafted during the inundation season, when farming was impossible and the state offered work on royal projects. There is no archaeological or literary evidence that the pyramids were built by slaves. They were built by Egyptians. Khufu was succeeded by Djedefer, one of his sons, who was not the designated heir but seized the throne anyway. Djedefer's reign is short and disputed. Some scholars believe he, not his brother Khofre, was responsible for the Great Sphinx of Giza. The Sphinx, the largest monolithic monument in the world, a recumbent lion's body crowned with a king's head and royal headdress, was traditionally identified as bearing the face of Khofre. Recent re-examinations by Egyptologists like Vasil Dobrev have argued for Khufu instead. But Khofre's pyramid is the second largest at Giza. Its complex almost as grand as his father's, and the Sphinx aligns precisely with it. The likeness, most scholars still think, is Khofre's. Khofre was followed, after the brief reign of Djedefer's son Baka, by Khofre's son Menkora. Menkora built the third and smallest of the Great Giza pyramids. Already, the resources that built the Great Pyramid were no longer there. Menkora reigned a long time, perhaps 30 years, but died before his own pyramid complex was finished. His designated heir Khuaner had died before him. The chain of succession was breaking down. Menkora's successor, Shepsiskaf, completed his predecessor's pyramid at Giza, but built no great monument of his own. He was buried in a modest mastaba at Saqqara, and the resources that had once flowed to the royal cult began, more and more, to flow to the priests who tended the funerary temples. Even after death, the kings of Egypt could not escape this slow seepage of power away from the throne. Old Kingdom Egypt was a thoroughly stratified society. At its top sat the king, who in theory owned every grain of soil. Beneath him sat the vizier, the Tjadi, an office formalized as early as the early dynastic period, and a hierarchy of court officials, nomarchs, priests, scribes, and overseers. The literate classes were a tiny fraction of the population, but they ran everything and left almost everything we know about the civilization behind. At the base of the pyramid sat the peasant farmers, who did not own the land they worked, but held it from the king, the court, the nomarchs, or the temples. They cultivated grain and gave most of it to the landowners, keeping a portion for themselves. Their women tended kitchen gardens. The men, when the Nile rose and the fields were drowned, went to work on the great state projects, temples, obelisks, pyramids. They were always paid. Unskilled laborers hauled stone. Skilled painters and engravers were prized and earned more. Carpenters, potters, and brewers could rise on the strength of their craft. Breweries in particular were often run by women, and beer was the staple drink of Egypt. Workers on the Giza Plateau received a beer ration 3 times a day. Beer, the Egyptians said, had been given to humanity by the god Osiris. The brewing itself was overseen by the goddess Tiganiat. Marriages were a domestic affair, not a religious one. Parents arranged most matches across all classes. Girls were often married at 12, boys at 15. The royal house used its daughters as instruments of diplomacy, promising infant princesses to foreign monarchs to seal treaties. But life was not all labor. Egyptians played hockey, swam, rowed, practiced archery, played board games. A favorite sport was a kind of water jousting on the Nile, two-man boat teams in which one paddler maneuvered, while the other tried to knock his opposite out of the rival skiff with a long pole. Their festivals were many varied and reliably built around the same two pillars, drinking and feasting. Their diet was mostly grain and vegetables. Meat was a luxury reserved largely for the wealthy. The fourth dynasty ended with Civilisation, and the fifth began with rather less ambition. The fifth dynasty, roughly 2494 to 2345 BC, is often called the dynasty of sun kings because so many of its rulers' names incorporate the name of the sun god Ra. The first of them, Userkaf, is most famous for the sun temple he raised at Abusir, a sign that the priesthood of Ra was rising in influence and that the king's role as the sun god's chief representative was being shared more widely with the cult. The mother of two of these kings was the formidable Khentkaus, probably a daughter of Menkora, who has her own Great Pyramid tomb at Giza. Userkaf's son Sahir was a capable monarch who led the first Egyptian expedition to Punt, a land somewhere along the Red Sea coast, possibly in the Horn of Africa, that became Egypt's source of incense, ebony, gold, ivory, and exotic animals. In time, Punt would be remembered almost as a sacred land at the edge of the world. Sahir raised his own temple to the sun at Abusir, decorated with palmiform columns that would become a stock feature of Egyptian architecture for the next 2,000 years. His son Neferkare followed him, and during his reign the priesthood gathered yet more power. So it continued through Neferefer, Shepsisker, Nusera Eni, and Menkaure, the last king to commission a sun temple, and then to Jedkare Isi. Jedkare Isi broke with the pattern. He built no sun temple. He reformed the bureaucracy. He cut the staffing of the funerary cults. He sponsored a second expedition to Punt, which brought enormous wealth and forged stronger trade ties. And most consequentially, he decentralized the administration of the kingdom, giving more authority to the local governors, the nomarchs, across Egypt's provinces. That decision would have long consequences. His successor Yunus was the first Egyptian king to have the interior of his pyramid inscribed with the spells we now call the pyramid texts, long sequences of magical and theological formulae meant to guide the king through the afterlife and into communion with Ra and Osiris. The pyramid texts are the oldest surviving body of religious literature on Earth. The sixth dynasty opened in 2045 BC with Teti, whose reign Manetho later claimed had ended in his own murder by his bodyguard. He was followed briefly by Userkare, perhaps a conspirator, and then by Pepi I, under whom the nomarchs grew steadily stronger. The pattern continued under Mariner Nemtiemsef I and Pepi II, the latter of whom is said to have reigned for nearly a century, ascending as a child and dying as an old man. By the end of his rule, the nomarchs and the priests were running the country in everything but name. When drought brought famine, there was no central authority capable of responding. After Pepi II came a brief flicker of two more rulers, Mariner Nemtiemsef II, and a king some scholars identify with the woman Herodotus calls Queen Nitocris, said to have avenged her brother's murder by drowning his killers at a banquet. And then the Old Kingdom was over. What followed was the first intermediate period, not a dark age, but a long rebalancing of power. The provinces took control of themselves. The kings of the 7th and 8th dynasties are little more than names in lists. Memphis was abandoned by some of them. The 9th and 10th dynasties set up their court at Heracleopolis and claimed kingship over a country that no longer really had a single ruler. Around 2125 BC, a Theban nomarch named Intef, the mighty, defied the Heracleopolitan kings, founded what we call the 11th dynasty, and laid the groundwork for the next phase of Egyptian history. His successors would push the unification forward. The Middle Kingdom was coming. Mentuhotep I picked up where Intef left off, conquering neighboring nomes for Thebes. His successors continued the work, and Mentuhotep II, remembered later as the second great unifier of Egypt, finished it, defeating the Heracleopolitan dynasty in battle, punishing those who had stayed loyal to them, and rewarding those who had supported Thebes. Around 2055 BC, Egypt was again one country, and the Middle Kingdom had begun. Mentuhotep II spent the rest of his long reign ruling, campaigning, and building. His son Mentuhotep II dispatched an expedition to Punt and reinforced the northern delta's frontiers. Mentuhotep IV, his son, ruled briefly and quietly, and the dynasty ended with him. His vizier Amenemhat, while leading a quarrying expedition to gather stone for the king's sarcophagus, recorded an extraordinary set of events on a stone stele. A gazelle had given birth on the very block selected for the lid, a sign that the block had been fated to receive the king. An unexpected rainfall had revealed a well large enough to water his entire expedition, another sign of divine favor. The story would be remembered as evidence that Amenemhat himself had been chosen by the gods. He ascended the throne, founded the 12th dynasty, and moved his court from Thebes to a new capital at Ijtawi, south of Memphis. The 12th dynasty is the heart of the Middle Kingdom. Its kings restricted the power of the local nomarchs, kept wealth centralized in the crown, and at the same time allowed the provinces to grow and prosper. Senusret I built widely, including a temple to Amun at Karnak that would seed the great temple complex of later centuries. The dynasty institutionalized the practice of co-regency, in which an aging king would crown his designated heir during his own reign so the son could learn the office and ensure a smooth succession. Inscriptions with double dates on royal cartages mark this arrangement. Egyptian engineering reached new heights. Irrigation networks expanded across the floodplain. The Egyptians built nilometers, graduated stone shafts beside the river, to measure the height of each year's flood and predict the harvest and therefore the taxes. Senusret II had a canal cut to channel water from Lake Moeris and turned the Fayum Basin into one of the kingdom's great agricultural centers. His white chapel at Karnak, a delicate Jubilee shrine, survives in part, and its inscriptions list every nome, every district of Egypt of the time. Senusret Ios, who succeeded Amenemhat II and Senusret II, was the most formidable king of the dynasty, so successful that he was deified during his own lifetime. He drove military campaigns deep into Nubia, fortified the southern border with a chain of mud brick frontier forts, and pushed into Palestine, opening new trade routes there. He reorganized the country into 3 great administrative provinces and broke the back of the old nomarchical class. His successor Amenemhat III built almost as much as his father and oversaw the construction of the great mortuary complex at Hawara, a maze-like structure known later to the Greeks as the Labyrinth. The Egyptians of this period documented their daily life in extraordinary detail. Tomb paintings show farmers planting and harvesting emmer wheat, pressing grapes for wine, gathering palm, dates, and figs, cutting papyrus for the boats, and the scrolls that recorded everything they did. A simple, ingenious device called the shaduf, a long balanced pole with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, let a single farmer lift water from the river to irrigate his fields, and the tombs also show how they moved their colossal stones. In the burial chapel of Juhudi-Hotep, a nomarch of the 12th dynasty who governed the Hair Nome in Upper Egypt, a scene depicts 172 men hauling a roughly 7-meter-high seated statue of him on a wooden sledge. A single laborer in front of the statue pours water onto the ground to reduce friction. No trace of the colossus itself has ever been found. Amenemhat IV continued his father's projects but left no male heir. The throne passed to his sister Sobneferu, whose brief reign closed the 12th dynasty. She is the first securely attested female pharaoh in Egyptian history. Nitocris, the 6th dynasty queen Herodotus describes, may have been earlier, but the evidence for her is shaky. When Sobekneferu died without heirs, the 13th dynasty took over, a string of short, weak reigns that inherited the wealth and the policies of their predecessors, but could not hold the country together. Lower Egypt began to slip from central control. Hutwert, known in Greek as Avaris, had been founded under the 12th dynasty as a small settlement at the eastern edge of the delta, with easy access to the sea and the overland routes into Sinai and the Levant. Under the 13th dynasty, immigration and trade made it a thriving cosmopolitan hub, populated more and more by Semitic-speaking peoples from the Levant. In time, the Egyptians would call them the Heka Kosut, rulers of foreign lands. The Greeks would later transcribe that title as Hyksos. Their origin has been disputed for centuries. The old idea that they were a homogeneous racial group fleeing an Aryan invasion of Asia, popular in the racial theorizing of the 19th and early 20th centuries, has been thoroughly discredited. They were, in fact, Levantine populations who had been drifting into the delta for generations through the ordinary channels of trade and migration. The Egyptian sources call them Asiatics, a label they applied to almost anyone east of the Sinai. Over time, the immigrant community at Avaris grew wealthy enough and politically organized enough to seize power. They became the 15th dynasty. While the 13th dynasty also lost its grip on the south, Egyptian garrisons in Nubia were no longer being resupplied or rotated. The soldiers stayed where they were, married locally, became traders rather than guards. The kingdom of Kush, with its capital at Kerma, consolidated as a centralized power along the Upper Nile. By the late Second Intermediate Period, Thebes was pinned, Hyksos to the north, Kush to the south, both growing stronger. The Hyksos kings ruled their part of Egypt in Egyptian style. They adopted Egyptian dress and customs, took on Egyptian throne names, sponsored Egyptian temples, and assimilated themselves to the institutions they had inherited. The best known of them is Apepi, known in Greek as Apophis, after the giant serpent of darkness that wars with the sun god Ra each night. According to Manetho, Apepi sent a famously insulting letter to the Theban king Seqenenre-Tau, complaining that the snorting of the hippopotami in a pool at Thebes was keeping him awake at night in Avaris, 500 miles away. The hippopotamus had a sacred role in Theban religion. The message was a calculated provocation. Tau took it as a declaration of war and marched on Avaris. He lost, and his mummy, with its catastrophic head wounds, tells the story plainly. He was killed on the field. His son Chamos took up the fight. He left a bitter inscription complaining at the indignity of paying tribute to Asiatics while sharing his country with foreigners north and south, and launched a major campaign that drove deep into Hyksos territory, even if his boast that he raised Avaris was an exaggeration. The Hyksos were still in place when he died, but the tide had turned. It was Camos's brother Amosi who finally drove them out, besieging Avaris, taking it, then pursuing the fleeing Hyksos into the Levant and besieging their fortress at Sharuhan in southern Palestine for 6 years. The Hyksos disappear from history after that, into the wider populations of the Levant. Amosai did not merely close the second intermediate period. He opened the new kingdom, Egypt's imperial age. He founded the 18th dynasty, and, crucially, he made the army a permanent professional institution. Never again, he resolved, would a foreign people take Egypt by drifting unopposed across the border. The new kingdom is the era of the great pharaohs the modern world remembers. Hatshepsut, Thutmose Iaa, Akhen, Tutankhamun, Ramesses II. It is the period of the imperial conquests, the Karnak temple complex in its full glory, the Valley of the Kings, and Egypt as one of the great powers of the ancient Near East. Amos's son Amenhotep, I followed his father's policies and is remembered as a warrior king, though most of his campaigns appear to have been in Nubia. After him came Thutmose I, who reigned roughly 1520 to 1492 BC, and through Egypt's reach further than it had ever gone before. He put down a Nubian revolt, personally killing the Nubian chief and, according to inscription, hanging the body from the prow of his ship as he sailed back north. He pushed Egyptian power deep into Nubia and then turned to the Levant and Syria, where his armies reached the Euphrates. He expanded the temple at Karnak and built widely. Thutmose II, his son, reigned briefly and unmemorably. He had one daughter by his principal wife Hatshepsut, and one son, the future Thutmose II, by a minor consort. When Thutmose II died, his son was a boy. Hatshepsut was appointed regent. Within a few years, she had taken the full titles of pharaoh and was co-ruling as senior partner. Hatshepsut, who reigned roughly 1479 to 1458 BC, was one of the most successful pharaohs of the new kingdom. She mounted the most lavishly documented expedition to Punt. Its reliefs survive in her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, and brought back myrrh trees that she planted in temple gardens. She added monuments to Karnak, including 2 of the largest obelisks ever raised in Egypt. She built her own great terraced mortuary temple against the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari. The unfinished obelisk that still lies in the granite quarry at Aswan was probably commissioned by her, intended perhaps as a companion to what we now call the Lateran obelisk, originally erected at Karnak, later carried to Rome in 357 AD on the orders of the Emperor Constantius II, and now standing in the Piazza San Giovanni in Laterano. After her death, her name was systematically erased from many of her monuments, almost certainly by order of Thutmose Iaa, or perhaps his son Amenhotep II. The reasons remain debated. Resentment over a stolen reign, dynastic legitimation, an effort to consolidate the male royal line, we do not know. When Thutmose Iaa took sole power in 1458 BC, he wasted no time. He is the king who built the Egyptian empire. He led at least 17 separate campaigns into the Levant and Mesopotamia in under 20 years. Believing the new pharaoh to be inexperienced, the city of Kadesh in Syria had instigated a wide revolt across Canaan, and Thutmose II marched out of Thebes to meet it. The rebel coalition gathered at the fortress city of Megiddo. Thutmose chose to advance through a narrow mountain pass at Aruna, riskier but unexpected, and burst onto the plain behind his enemies, driving them off the field and besieging Megiddo until it surrendered. His military scribe Tijani accompanied him on campaign and kept the records. Thutmose was so taken with Tijani's account that he ordered selections of it carved onto the walls of the great temple of Amun at Karnak. These inscriptions, what we now call the Annals of Thutmose Elii, are the earliest surviving detailed military history of any campaign. Year by year, Thutmose subdued Kadesh, subjugated all of Syria, and pushed Egyptian influence into the lands of the Mitanni and Mesopotamia. Egypt at his death ran from the upper Euphrates to deep into Nubia, His son Amenhotep II succeeded him in 1425 BC. Amenhotep II was less a warrior than a settler of accounts. He campaigned, but he also signed peace treaties, including with the Mitanni, who had been Egypt's enemies for 2 generations. Thutmose IV followed. He reigned roughly 1400 to 1390 BC, and although there is some scholarly speculation that he was not the originally designated heir, the famous dream steal between the paws of the Great Sphinx records that the Sphinx appeared to him in a dream and promised him the throne if he cleared the sand from its body. He is the lawful son of Amenhotep II. What he is actually remembered for is the dream steal itself, and the restoration of the Sphinx that the steal commemorates. The Sphinx by the New Kingdom was largely buried in sand. Thutmose IV had it cleared. He did not, despite occasional confusion, restore the Great Pyramid. The Sphinx is his monument. Amenhotep II succeeded him in 1386 BC and reigned 33 years. His Egypt sat at the apex of its wealth, power, and cultural confidence. He campaigned little but spent richly, using his treasury to influence other courts, marry off princesses for alliances, and finance some of the most lavish building in Egyptian history. Many of the monuments tourists travel to see today date from his reign. He also began a long, careful effort to balance the priesthood of Amun-Ra, who had grown so wealthy and politically powerful that they rivaled the throne. He raised the cult of a minor solar deity, Aten, the visible disk of the sun, and attached himself to it, hoping that the sponsorship of an alternative god could check the power of the Amun temples. The strategy did not save him, but it laid the foundations for the religious explosion that came with his son. That son was Amenhotep IV. After about 5 years on the throne, he changed his name to Akhenaten. He who was effective for the Aten closed the temples of Amun, suppressed the old gods, founded a new capital halfway between Memphis and Thebes at a site now called Tel El Amarna, and proclaimed the Aten the one true god. His 17-year reign is the Amarna period. Whether Atenism is called monotheism, henotheism, or solar monolatry depends on which scholar you read. But the religious revolution was real. It concentrated all worship in the king and his god, dissolved the priesthoods, and produced an utterly distinctive art style that softened and elongated the human figure, depicting royal women and children with affectionate naturalism unique in Egyptian art. Akhenaten's wife was Nefertiti, whose painted limestone bust, sculpted by the master Thutmose and discovered in his Amarna workshop, has become one of the most recognizable images of antiquity. When Akhenaten died, the country was in trouble. The traditional priesthoods had been silenced, foreign affairs neglected, the army demoralized. The crown passed to his young son, Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, who within 2 years renamed himself Tutankhamun, returned the court to Memphis, reopened the temples of Amun, and undid most of his father's reforms. He came to the throne at about 9 years old and died at about 18, in 1327 BC. He is, in historical terms, a relatively minor pharaoh, but his tomb, almost untouched by the robbers who plundered every other valley of the king's burial, was found by Howard Carter in November 1922, and his golden funerary mask has become the single most famous artifact in all of antiquity. Tutankhamun was married to his half-sister Ankhesenamun. After his death, she vanishes from the record. She may have married Ai, the elderly vizier who briefly took the throne. She may have tried to rule alone. We do not know. The general Hormheb seized power soon after and ruled with a steady, deliberate hand. He set about erasing the Amarna period from Egyptian memory, toppling Akhenaten statues, dismantling his temple at Karnak, striking his name from king lists. He restored traditional religion. He fought to restore Egypt standing abroad, though he did not reach the heights of Amenhotep II. He died without an heir, leaving the throne to his loyal general and vizier Paramis, who took the throne name Ramesses I and founded the 19th dynasty. Ramesses I was already an old man when he became pharaoh. He did not reign long. He set his son Seti I beside him as co-ruler and military commander, and Seti restored Egyptian power in Canaan and Syria. When Seti died, the throne passed to his son. That son was Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. He ruled for 67 years, from 1279 to 1213 BC. He built more, fathered more children, married more wives, and erected more monuments than any other pharaoh. His face is everywhere from Abu Simbel to Karnak. And although the Battle of Kadesh, the great event of his early reign, was at best a tactical draw, his other great achievement was almost certainly the more important. The first peace treaty in recorded history. The Hittites of Anatolia had been gathering strength since the 2nd millennium BC. By the time of Akhenaten, they were a major power on the Egyptian frontier, to whom Akhenaten had not bothered to reply. Hormheb had pushed back against them, Seti I had retaken Kadesh in Syria but neglected to garrison it. So in 1274 BC, the young Ramesses II mustered his armies, 20,000 men in 4 divisions, named for the gods Amun, Re, Ta, and Sutek, and marched on Kadesh to break Hittite power. He marched too fast. Riding at the head of the Amun division in his war chariot, he outpaced the other 3. Near Kadesh, his scouts captured Tuduan, smooth Hittite Bedouin, who told him, smoothly, that the other 2 and his army were nowhere near the city, that Muwatalli feared Egypt and the young pharaoh. They were lying. They were Hittite spies. Muwatalli's army, 37,000 men and 3,500 chariots, was waiting just over the next hill. By the time Ramesses captured more reliable scouts and learned the truth, the Hittite chariotry was already smashing into the half-built Egyptian camp. The Re division was scattered. The Amun division was nearly overrun. Ramesses, isolated, charged the chariots himself with what cavalry he had. The Ta division arrived in time to turn the battle. Ramesses personally led repeated charges back into the fight, pushing the Hittites onto the Orontes River, where many of them drowned. Muwatalli, watching from the walls of Kadesh, had positioned reserves to encircle the Egyptians, but for reasons that have puzzled historians ever since, he never sent them in. The battle ended in stalemate. Ramesses did not take Kadesh, but he had broken the Hittite assault, and he had survived. Both sides went home claiming victory. Both inscribed elaborate accounts on temple walls. Ramesses's version, written all over Egypt, became one of the most famous pieces of royal propaganda in the ancient world. 15 years later, however, came something more remarkable. In 1259 BC, Ramesses II and the new Hittite king Hattusili III signed a formal peace treaty, a mutual non-aggression pact, an extradition treaty, a defensive alliance. We have it in 2 languages, Egyptian on the walls of Karnak and the Ramesseum, and Akkadian on cuneiform tablets from the Hittite capital of Hattusa. It is the oldest peace treaty in human history, whose full text survives, and a copy hangs today at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. After Ramesses II came his 13th son Merneptah, only on the throne because all the older sons had died waiting for it. Merneptah defeated a Libyan invasion and beat back the first major incursion of the mysterious raiders known as the Sea Peoples. His victory stele also contains the earliest known reference to a people called Israel in the context of a campaign in Canaan. The Sea Peoples are one of the great enigmas of the Late Bronze Age. They appear in Egyptian and Levantine sources as a coalition of seaborne raiders, Shurden, Peliset, Tijekerlaka Ekwesh, others whose attacks helped shatter the Hittite Empire, sacked great cities up and down the eastern Mediterranean coast, and converged on Egypt in 2 great waves. The first, around 1207 BC, Merneptah turned back. The second, around 1175 BC, came under Ramesses II. Ramesses II, the last great king of the New Kingdom, refused to meet the Sea Peoples in open field battle. He read the lessons of his predecessors and chose ambush instead. He drew their ships into the Nile Delta, hid his archers in cover along the banks, and at his signal showered the enemy fleet with fire arrows. The boats burned in the water. The survivors who reached land were caught by his infantry. The Sea Peoples were broken at the so-called Battle of the Delta. Some he sold into slavery. Some he settled along the Levantine coast as garrison subjects. The Peliset became the Philistines of the Bible. Others he conscripted into his own army. His victory saved Egypt from the catastrophe that engulfed almost every other Late Bronze Age power. But it nearly bankrupted the treasury. For the first time in recorded history, workers walked off the job. The artisans of Deir el-Medina, the village of craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, struck against the state when their grain rations failed to arrive on schedule. The strike of 1159 BC is the first labor action documented anywhere on Earth. Ramesses III ended his reign assassinated. Modern CT scans of his mummy revealed a deep cut across his throat. The plot, the Harem conspiracy, was led by one of his secondary wives, Ti, who hoped to put her son Pentuer on the throne instead of the legitimate heir. The papyrus record of the subsequent trials survives. The conspirators were executed. Pentuer was forced to take his own life. After Ramesses II, the new kingdom decayed slowly. A long line of Ramesses, Ramesses IV through Ramesses XI, fought to keep the empire together against external pressure and an increasingly powerful priesthood of Amun, whose high priests at Thebes had become a state within a state. By the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt was effectively divided in 2. The priests of Amun controlled the south from Thebes, and a new dynasty at Tanis controlled the north. This is the 3rd intermediate period. Smendes, ruler of Lower Egypt from Tanis, buried the last Ramesses. The Theban high priest Hariher ruled the south as a parallel king in everything but title. The pattern would hold for centuries. Local strongmen and priest kings fragmented authority, sporadic glimpses of unity. The 22nd dynasty came from a Libyan family. Its founder, Shoshenkas, known in the Hebrew Bible as Shishak, the pharaoh who is said to have raided Jerusalem in the reign of Rehoboam, reunited Egypt and revived some of the country's old assertiveness, even campaigning in the Levant. After him, Osorkon II held the country together. But after Osorkon's death, Egypt splintered into a patchwork of regional kingdoms: Heracleopolis, Tanis, Memphis, Hermopolis, and Thebes, each ruled by its own king or warlord. Into that fragmented landscape came the Kushites from the south. The Nubian kingdom of Kush, centered at Napata, had quietly Egyptianized itself for generations, adopting Egyptian writing, religion, and royal iconography. The king Kashta moved north and took Upper Egypt without serious resistance. His son Pi, sometimes spelled Pianki, completed the work. When the kings of Lower Egypt revolted, Pi marched a great army north, besieged their cities one by one, and accepted their surrender. He then returned home to Napata, leaving Egypt nominally his but practically self-governing. The Kushites became the 25th dynasty. What ended that dynasty was Assyria. Under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire invaded Egypt, sacked Memphis, sacked Thebes, and broke Kushite power. The Assyrians did not stay, but in their wake they left Asgudtoz, a man named Psamtik I, founder of the 26th dynasty, the Sate Renaissance. Psamtik I, the Greeks called him Psammetichus, restored unity, drove out the Assyrians, revived old religious traditions, and consciously imitated the art and architecture of the Old Kingdom. His son Necho II carried on the work. The Egyptians had never been great sailors, so Necho hired Greek mercenary marines to serve in his navy, and they served him well. He campaigned in the Levant, fought the Babylonians at Carchemish, and is said by Herodotus to have dispatched a Phoenician fleet on a voyage that circumnavigated Africa. Later in the dynasty came Amasis II, who balanced government spending, encouraged the economy, kept the frontiers secure, and presided over a brief restoration of Egypt's old prestige. But the Sate revival could not hold. To the east, the Persian Empire under Cambyses II was rising. Amasis tried to head off conflict by sending Cambyses a princess as a bride, but unwilling to send one of his own daughters, he sent instead the daughter of the previous king a prize. When the princess reached Cambyses' court, she revealed the deception. Cambyses, insulted, prepared for war. By the time he invaded, Amasis was dead, and the inexperienced young king Psamtik I was on the throne. The Egyptians lost. In 525 BC, Cambyses became pharaoh, Egypt's first Persian ruler, and the founder of the 27th dynasty. Cambyses' successor Darius treated Egypt with the famously tolerant hand of the Persian kings. He visited the country at least twice. He poured funds into the restoration of damaged temples. He honored the Egyptian gods with offerings and statues. Egyptian religion and culture were left intact. His son Xerxes I, who would invade Greece and lose at Salamis in 480 BC and Plataea in 479 BC, drew heavily on Egyptian resources for the campaign. After the Persian defeat in Greece, Xerxes turned away from foreign affairs, and Persian attention to Egypt slackened. Egyptian resistance to Persian rule was constant. In 460 BC, a Libyan Egyptian dynast named Inaros, son of a member of the old Sate royal house, led a major revolt backed by Athens, which sent a fleet that lasted 6 years before Artaxerxes I crushed it. Through the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, native Egyptian kings reclaimed independence in fits and starts. Amyatius, Nectanebo I, Nectanebo II. The Persians invaded again in 343 BC and established the 31st dynasty. But that second Persian occupation would last only a decade, because by then, far to the northwest, a new power was rising. Philip II of Macedon had unified the Greek city-states under his crown and was preparing a grand campaign of conquest against Persia. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, he left his armies and his ambitions to his 20-year-old son Alexander. Alexander would take Egypt without a battle. The Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. He was crowned pharaoh at Memphis, founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast called Alexandria, and traveled to the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis, where the priests are said to have declared him the son of the god. His brief stay in Egypt ended with his march east into Asia. When he died in Babylon in 323 BC, his vast empire fragmented among his generals. Egypt fell to one of them, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who would found the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last to rule a sovereign Egypt, and end 3 centuries later with the death of Cleopatra VI in 30 BC. The pharaohs of the 30th dynasty had defended the old order honorably to the last. Native kingship would not return, But to call this the end of Egyptian civilization is to misunderstand the depth of what had been built. The temples kept functioning under the Ptolemies and the Romans, with hieroglyphs being carved on their walls for centuries. The Egyptian language survived in the form we call Coptic, used today in the liturgy of the Egyptian Christian Church and surviving as loanwords in the Arabic dialect of modern Egypt. The festivals of the Nile flood were absorbed into Christian and then Muslim celebrations. The traditions never fully died. Modern Egypt walks today on layers of itself. The Nile is still the lifeline. The springtime festival of Sham el-Nessim, observed across the country, dates back to pharaonic times. The food carries the flavor of the ancient kitchens. The parades that escorted the royal mummies through Cairo to their new home in the Museum of Egyptian Civilization in 2021 were watched by millions. The Avenue of Sphinxes at Luxor was ceremonially reopened the same year. The Grand Egyptian Museum, opening at Giza, is poised to become the largest archaeological museum in the world. Excavations turn up new discoveries every season. Somewhere in the sand, a tomb as great as Tutankhamun's may still be waiting. And the country itself, the slim green ribbon of the Nile threaded through the desert, remains, as it was for Herodotus, a gift of the river, a story written in stone and water, dazzling and enchanting, generation after generation, the people who come to read it.